28, heroin, morphine. That's how the extraordinary voice fell silent. Official report? Accident. But was it just a tragic misstep? Or the inevitable final chapter? This was simply the last stop on a 10-year journey of self-destruction, expressed note by note through pain. The Tim Buckley journey. Because that remarkable voice wasn't a gift. It seemed born from the trauma of childhood abuse. That relentless creativity wasn't just art. It felt like a desperate attempt to outrun his demons. His music wasn't life-affirming. It carried the tension of impending implosion, present from the start. This wasn't just a story about a tragedy. It was the autopsy of self-destruction expressed in song. Timothy Charles Buckley III entered the world on Valentine's Day, February 14, 1947, in Washington, D.C. It was a time of cautious optimism in America. World War II was over. The nation was beginning to embrace a new era of prosperity, but the psychological impact of the conflict lingered beneath the surface. His heritage was a potent mix, a common American story of immigrant roots. His mother, Elaine, was of Italian-American descent, a woman with a refined taste for sophisticated jazz. The cool, introspective sounds of Miles Davis were reportedly often heard in their home. His father, Timothy Charles Buckley Jr., was of Irish descent, a decorated World War II veteran who had served with distinction. On paper, it seemed like a stable post-war family, but the private reality was far darker. Shortly after Tim's birth, the young family relocated from the nation's capital to Amsterdam, New York. Situated about 40 miles west of Albany, Amsterdam in the late 1940s and 50s was a small, somewhat isolated industrial city, its fortunes tied to the declining carpet mills that lined the Mohawk River. It was a tough working-class town, populated largely by families of Irish and Italian immigrants, a place where life often felt circumscribed by the factory whistle and the neighborhood boundaries. Image montage? Black and white photos of Amsterdam, NY in the 1950s, mills, modest houses, street scenes. It was here, in this close-knit but perhaps claustrophobic environment, that the defining tragedy of Tim Buckley's young life unfolded. His father, Timothy Buckley Jr., the war hero, carried deep, unhealed wounds from his time in combat. He struggled with severe alcoholism, and his drinking often unleashed a terrifying, violent rage directed primarily at his young, sensitive son. The details, pieced together years later from interviews with Tim and those who knew the family, paint a harrowing picture of chronic domestic abuse. Timothy Jr. reportedly subjected his son to frequent physical beatings, but perhaps even more damaging was the relentless psychological torment. He belittled Tim constantly, mocking his emerging sensitivity, his burgeoning interest in music. He used cruel homophobic slurs, calling his own son a faggot, attempting to crush any perceived deviation from a narrow, rigid definition of masculinity. He actively discouraged Tim's musical inclinations, viewing them not as a gift but as a sign of weakness, a failure to measure up to his own hard-bitten, perhaps damaged ideal of manhood. For a young boy, especially one as inherently sensitive and intuitive as Tim Buckley appears to have been, this constant barrage of violence and denigration from his own father was profoundly damaging psychologically. It created a profound and lasting psychological wound, a deep-seated sense of inadequacy, a confusion about his own identity and masculinity, and a pervasive feeling of being fundamentally unsafe in his own home. In a searingly honest interview with Downbeat magazine in 1974, just a year before his death, Buckley would describe his father simply and chillingly as the enemy. The antagonistic relationship was established early, and the war within his own family home would shape the contours of his entire life and art. Elaine, his mother, provided a crucial counterpoint to this darkness. It was she who filled the house with music, with the sophisticated sounds of modern jazz. While his father raged, Tim found refuge in the cool, intricate, emotionally complex world of Miles Davis, Chet Baker, the sounds his mother loved. It was an early subconscious education in musical sophistication, improvisation, and the power of music to convey deep emotion without resorting to bombast. But while Elaine nurtured his musical ear, she was seemingly unable, or perhaps unwilling, to intervene effectively against her husband's violence. This created another layer of complexity in Tim's young emotional landscape. A loving mother who provided solace, but also a figure who could not fully protect him from his father's abuse. This early experience of love intertwined with helplessness, of beauty existing alongside brutality, would echo throughout his later relationships and his often contradictory artistic output. He learned very early on to build walls around himself, to retreat into an internal world where he felt safe. And increasingly, that internal world was filled with sound. Music became more than just a pleasure. It became essential for his emotional survival, a way to escape the unbearable noise of his reality. He began to listen with intense focus, driven by desperation, absorbing melodies and rhythms, finding in the structure and emotion of music a sense of order and meaning that was absent in his chaotic home life. The constant tension, the violence, and perhaps the economic struggles of a declining industrial town eventually took their toll on the family unit. The specifics are unclear, but the narrative suggests a family slowly fraying at the seams. In 1956, when Tim was 9 years old, another major upheaval occurred. The Buckley family left the cold gray confines of Amsterdam, New York, and journeyed across the country, seeking a new beginning under the bright, promising sun of Southern California. They settled in Bell Gardens, a working-class suburb southeast of Los Angeles. But the change of scenery would not mean an escape from the shadows that haunted their family. The move to Southern California in 1956 plunged 9-year-old Tim Buckley into a world that was radically different from the one he had known. Bell Gardens, like much of the sprawling Los Angeles basin in the post-war era, was a landscape of tract housing, burgeoning freeways, and a restless, optimistic energy fueled by sunshine and the promise of the burgeoning aerospace and entertainment industries. It was also, crucially for Tim's musical development, a place of incredible cultural cross-pollination. Image montage, Southern California suburbs, 1950s to 60s, tract houses, wide streets, maybe early Disneyland footage. Unlike the relatively homogeneous Irish-Italian enclave of Amsterdam, New York, Southern California was a melting pot of sounds. The musical education that had begun with his mother's jazz records now expanded exponentially. His maternal grandmother, who lived nearby, introduced him to the raw, powerful voices of early blues and jazz singers, the Empress Bessie Smith, the tragic, incomparable Billie Holiday. He heard the deep, foundational sorrow and resilience in their voices, another layer of emotional complexity to absorb. His mother continued to play her records, exposing him to the sophisticated pop vocal stylings of Frank Sinatra and the dramatic heart-on-sleeve performances of Judy Garland. These singers taught him about phrasing, about breath control, about the art of inhabiting a lyric and conveying a story through pure vocal performance. And even his troubled father contributed inadvertently to this eclectic soundtrack. Timothy Jr. was a fan of country music, the raw, honky-tonk sounds of Hank Williams, and the deep, resonant baritone of Johnny Cash often filling the house alongside his drunken rages. From them, Tim absorbed the direct, unadorned storytelling and the raw, emotional honesty that characterized the best country music. Jazz, blues, classic pop, country, this incredibly diverse range of influences poured into the fertile ground of Tim Buckley's young, receptive mind. He was becoming a human synthesizer, subconsciously blending these disparate styles, laying the groundwork for the genre-defying music he would later create. But the sunshine of California did not heal the darkness within the Buckley family. Timothy Jr.'s alcoholism reportedly worsened in the new environment. The family's financial situation remained precarious. The domestic turmoil continued, perhaps even escalated. For Tim, now entering his sensitive and turbulent teenage years, the need for escape became even more urgent. Music was no longer just a refuge. It was becoming an obsession, a potential lifeline out of the chaos. Around the age of 13 in 1960, he picked up his first instrument in earnest. It wasn't a guitar, the obvious choice for a budding folk singer. It was a banjo. Perhaps it was simply what was available, or perhaps he was drawn to its bright, ringing tone, its roots in traditional American folk music. He taught himself to play, likely picking out the simple chords of the folk songs that were beginning to dominate the airwaves thanks to the burgeoning folk revival, led by groups like the Kingston Trio. This initial foray into folk music provided him with a crucial framework. He formed his first real band, a simple folk group with a friend named Dan Gordon. They played Kingston Trio covers and other popular folk songs at local school events and hootenannies. It was his first experience performing his own music for an audience, his first taste of the connection that could be forged through song. But even as he was mastering the relatively simple structures of folk music, his ears, trained by years of intensive listening, were already pulling him in more complex directions. He continued to immerse himself in jazz, gravitating towards the more challenging, progressive sounds of artists like Miles Davis and the spiritual searching saxophone improvisations of John Coltrane. He was fascinated by their harmonic complexity, their rhythmic freedom, their willingness to push the boundaries of musical expression. And crucially, he began to consciously develop his most extraordinary instrument, his voice. He realized, perhaps intuitively, that his voice was his most extraordinary asset, the one thing that could truly set him apart. Inspired by the incredible range and emotional depth of the singers he admired, from the smooth crooning of Nat King Cole and Johnny Mathis to the raw power of Billie Holiday and the soaring improvisations of jazz instrumentalists, he began to experiment, to push the limits of his own vocal cords. He possessed a naturally beautiful, pure, Irish tenor voice, a gift inherited perhaps from his father's side. But he wasn't content with just that. He began stretching his range, working obsessively to develop both his lower register, moving down into a warm baritone, and, most dramatically, his upper register, soaring into an ethereal flute-like falsetto. He practiced constantly, reportedly imitating the sounds of instruments, particularly trumpets, trying to replicate their phrasing and tone with his voice. There are even stories, possibly apocryphal but revealing, of him screaming at passing buses, not out of anger, but as a raw, unconventional form of vocal training, pushing his voice to its absolute physical limits. Through this combination of natural gift and relentless, obsessive practice, he forged an instrument of astonishing range and flexibility. By his mid-teens, he possessed a voice that spanned, according to most estimates, at least 4 octaves, a truly freakish range for a male pop singer. He could move seamlessly from a conversational baritone to a soaring tenor to an angelic falsetto, and even into shrieks and cries that seemed to bypass language altogether, communicating pure, primal emotion. This voice, born from a need to escape, a need to compensate, a need to create beauty in the face of ugliness, would become his signature, his blessing, and perhaps ultimately his curse. But the same sensitivity that fueled his musical gift also made him acutely vulnerable to the ongoing turmoil at home. The violence and emotional abuse reportedly continued throughout his teenage years. This contributed to his profound insecurity and a cynical, distrustful view of the world that would become characteristic of his later personality. He learned to protect himself, to hide his vulnerability behind a mask of cool detachment or ironic humor. According to Lee Underwood, his future lead guitarist and close friend, who provided invaluable insights in later interviews and writings, Tim was deeply afraid of showing any perceived weakness, a fear directly rooted in the abuse he suffered at the hands of his father. This fear also manifested in a tendency towards embellishment, even outright fabrication when discussing his own past. He began constructing a personal mythology, perhaps as another form of self-protection, or simply out of a young man's desire to seem more interesting, more rebellious, more conventionally masculine than he felt inside. He would later admit to embroidering truths. This seemingly small embellishment speaks volumes about his deep-seated insecurities and his complex relationship with his own identity. He was already learning to use stories, both in song and in life, as a way to reshape a painful reality. By 1964, the internal and external pressures were mounting. He was a young man overflowing with talent and ambition, trapped between the suffocating reality of his family life and the tantalizing promise of the burgeoning music scene just up the freeway in Los Angeles. The internal pressures built over years in the quiet darkness of his childhood. A breaking point was approaching. The early 1960s were a period of intense transition for Tim Buckley, a whirlwind of high school angst, musical exploration, burgeoning rebellion, and the first tentative steps towards a professional career. He attended Buena Vista High School initially, but later transferred to Loara High School in Anaheim in 1965 when his family moved again. Searching, perhaps, for a stability that remained elusive. He tried briefly to fit the mold of the all-American teenager. He played baseball, but his heart wasn't truly in it. A significant hand injury sustained during this period, reportedly breaking 2 fingers on his left hand in 1962, made playing certain complex guitar chords, particularly barre chords, difficult. This physical limitation, however, inadvertently pushed his creativity. Unable to rely on standard chord shapes, he began experimenting with unusual extended voicings and open tunings, developing a unique and harmonically rich guitar style that would perfectly complement his adventurous vocal melodies. What began as a handicap became a catalyst for innovation. His true passion remained music, and he began to find his tribe among other artistically inclined students. He formed 2 distinct musical groups during his high school years, showcasing the dichotomy that would define his entire career. The first, called the Bohemians, played popular music covers, likely reflecting the surf rock and pop sounds prevalent in Southern California at the time. The second, and perhaps more indicative of his future direction, was a more experimental group called Harlequin 3. This band, formed with his close friends Larry Beckett, a budding poet who would soon become his most important lyrical collaborator, and Jim Fielder, a talented bassist who would later gain fame with Blood, Sweat, and Tears and Buffalo Springfield, focused on a blend of folk music, spoken word, and beat poetry. This early experimentation with fusing music and literature, with pushing the boundaries of traditional song structures, was a clear foreshadowing of the avant-garde paths he would later explore. Around 1964, at the age of 17, Buckley made a claim that further blurred the lines between his reality and his self-constructed myth. He told friends he was dropping out of school to join a touring country band called Princess Ramona and the Cherokee Riders. Whether this band actually existed or if Tim ever truly toured with them remains highly dubious. Lee Underwood, his later guitarist, would dismiss it in the 1990s as likely another figment of his imagination, part of Tim's ongoing effort to craft a more romantic, road-tested backstory for himself. It was another layer added to the mystique, another embroidered truth. The year 1965 was a pivotal one, marked by both personal upheaval and profound new beginnings. His parents' troubled marriage finally ended in divorce, an event that likely brought a complex mix of relief and renewed instability to Tim's life. The enemy was no longer within the gates, but the foundation of his world had definitively fractured. It was also in 1965, during his senior year at Loara High, that he met Mary Guibert in French class. She was a year younger, intelligent, and captivated by his intense artistic aura. A passionate, intense romance quickly developed. After graduating from high school in the summer of 1965, Tim made a brief, half-hearted attempt at higher education, enrolling at Fullerton College that September. He lasted exactly 1 week before dropping out, confirming his commitment to pursuing music full-time. The structure of academia held no appeal for him. The smoky, chaotic world of the coffee houses and folk clubs was calling. He began playing gigs regularly at a small club called Two Tables in Bell Gardens, honing his performance skills and developing his unique repertoire. His personal life was moving just as rapidly. On October 25, 1965, barely 19 years old, he married his high school sweetheart, Mary Guibert, at St. Michael's Episcopal Church in Anaheim. It was a decision likely driven by youthful passion and perhaps a desire for the stability his own childhood had lacked, but the marriage was fraught with tension from the very beginning. They were young, broke, and Tim's all-consuming focus was now squarely on breaking into the fiercely competitive Los Angeles music scene. Mary quickly became pregnant, adding another layer of pressure and responsibility that the restless young artist seemed ill-equipped or perhaps unwilling to handle. Image relating to 1960s Orange County, Anaheim, if possible. The year 1966 would prove to be the most transformative year of his life, a dizzying 12 months of breakthroughs, heartbreaks, and irreversible choices. The Orange County folk scene, centered around clubs like the Paradox in Tustin, was beginning to blossom, with artists like Jackson Browne, Steve Noonan, and the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band creating a vibrant local community. Tim quickly became a standout figure in this scene, his extraordinary voice and unique songs capturing the attention of fellow musicians and industry insiders. His first crucial connection came through Jimmy Carl Black, the iconoclastic drummer for Frank Zappa's Mothers of Invention. Black saw Tim perform at The Trip, a legendary club on the Sunset Strip, in February 1966, and was blown away. He immediately recommended Tim to his manager, the equally legendary and notoriously eccentric Herb Cohen. Cohen, who also managed Zappa, Linda Ronstadt, and Captain Beefheart, recognized Tim's unique talent and took him under his wing. Cohen quickly arranged for Tim to travel to New York City in the spring of 1966. For a young musician from the West Coast, performing in the hallowed folk clubs of Greenwich Village, like the Night Owl Cafe where Tim played several gigs, was a rite of passage. It was during this New York sojourn that his already strained marriage began to truly unravel. He reportedly fell into a brief but intense affair with a woman named Janie Goldstein, living with her for a time in the gritty Bowery district, further distancing himself both physically and emotionally from his pregnant wife back in California. While in New York, Tim recorded a crucial demo tape, 6 songs showcasing his incredible voice and songwriting potential. Armed with this demo, Herb Cohen secured him a deal with Elektra Records, the prestigious label founded by Jack Holzman, known for its roster of adventurous folk, rock, and psychedelic artists like The Doors, Love, and Judy Collins. Holzman was reportedly captivated by the demo, particularly by the sheer unearthly beauty of Tim's voice. In August 1966, Tim Buckley officially signed with Elektra. He returned to Los Angeles and was immediately rushed into Sunset Sound Recorders to record his debut album. The sessions were reportedly completed in just 3 intense days, produced by Paul Rothchild and Jack Nitsche, with sophisticated string arrangements by Nitsche. The band included his high school friend Jim Fielder on bass and the incredibly talented guitarist Lee Underwood, whose intricate, jazz-inflected playing would become the perfect foil for Tim's adventurous vocals for years to come. But even as his professional dreams were finally coming true, his personal life was imploding. In October 1966, just weeks before his debut album was set to be released, and just 1 month before the birth of his son, Tim and Mary divorced. The reasons were complex, rooted in their youth, the pressures of poverty, Tim's infidelity, and perhaps most significantly, his all-consuming, almost ruthless dedication to his burgeoning career. He seemed to view his marriage and impending fatherhood as obstacles to his artistic ambitions. On November 29, 1966, Mary Gibbert gave birth to their son, Jeffrey Scott Buckley. Tim was not present. In a decision that would profoundly affect both father and son for the rest of their lives, Tim effectively abandoned his child. He would meet Jeff only once, briefly, years later. This act of abandonment, born perhaps from his own wounded childhood and his deep-seated fear of repeating his father's failures, would create another profound wound, one that would echo tragically through 2 generations of brilliant, tormented musicians. In December 1966, the album Tim Buckley was released. Singles like Wings and Grief in My Soul were issued. He played high-profile gigs, opening for folk queen Joan Baez and sharing bills with the Mothers of Invention at Andy Warhol's Balloon Farm. On the surface, he had arrived. He was a signed recording artist on a major label, hailed as the next great voice in folk rock, but the album, despite its beauty, failed to capture the magic of his live performances and stalled commercially. Critics found it somewhat naive, even stiff. Elektra was reportedly disappointed, and Tim himself was already growing restless, chafing under the folk rock label and the expectations being placed upon him. The 19-year-old boy wonder, who had sacrificed his family for his art, found himself facing an uncertain future, already disillusioned with the dream he had chased so relentlessly. The journey had just begun, but the seeds of his future conflicts with the industry, with his audience, and ultimately with himself, was already established. He had arrived, but the destination felt hollow. Tim Buckley's debut album, released in late 1966, had announced the arrival of a major new voice, a pure Irish tenor capable of astonishing beauty. He had the record deal with Elektra, the hip label that housed The Doors. He had the management of the influential Herb Cohen. He had the haunting good looks and the undeniable talent. He had everything a young artist could seemingly wish for. But the album had stalled. It failed to capture the raw, improvisational magic of his live performances, sounding, even to his own ears, somewhat stiff and conventional. The critics were lukewarm, the sales disappointing. He was already being labeled, boxed in as just another sensitive folk rocker in a rapidly crowding field. And perhaps most painfully, the personal cost of achieving this initial fragile foothold had been immense. He had sacrificed his young marriage, effectively abandoned his newborn son, Jeffrey Scott, all in the relentless pursuit of an artistic dream that now felt somehow compromised, incomplete. The 19-year-old boy wonder found himself adrift, disillusioned with the very industry he had fought so hard to enter, and already profoundly restless. The folk rock sound that had launched him now felt restrictive. He needed to break free. He needed to find a sound that could contain the complex, often contradictory emotions within him. The echoes of his violent childhood, the weight of his recent personal betrayals, and the increasingly sophisticated, boundary-pushing musical ideas sparked by his love for jazz. The year 1967 was dawning. It was the summer of love, a time of explosive cultural change and artistic experimentation. And Tim Buckley was about to embark on his own personal revolution. The catalyst for Tim Buckley's first great artistic leap forward was a creative reunion. He reconnected with his old high school friend, the poet Larry Beckett. Beckett, who had been part of Tim's early experimental group Harlequin 3, was a writer of fierce intellect and burgeoning political consciousness. He provided Tim with the lyrical depth and thematic weight that had perhaps been missing from his debut. Together they began crafting a suite of songs that were far more ambitious, more complex, and more attuned to the turbulent spirit of the times than anything Tim had recorded before. Elektra Records, despite their disappointment with the first album's sales, still believed in Tim's potential. They paired him with a new producer, Jerry Yester, a musician associated with the Baroque pop sound of the Lovin' Spoonful and the modern folk quartet. Yesters understood Tim's desire to move beyond simple folk arrangements. He encouraged experimentation, bringing in session musicians who could handle more complex time signatures and harmonic structures, and incorporating elements of psychedelia and chamber pop into the sound, harpsichords, orchestral strings, layered vocal harmonies. The result, released in the pivotal summer of 1967, was the album Goodbye and Hello. From its striking symbolic cover art to its intricate multi-layered sound, the album represented a major artistic step forward. It was a work of remarkable ambition, a song cycle that grappled with themes of war, freedom, love, loss, and the search for identity. Beckett's lyrics provided the album's intellectual and political core. The epic multi-part title track was a sprawling, almost theatrical piece that contrasted the innocence of childhood with the harsh realities of adulthood and societal conformity. The searing anti-war anthem, No Man Can Find the War, captured the growing disillusionment and anger surrounding the escalating conflict in Vietnam with a poetic fury that resonated deeply with the counterculture. But it was on the songs where Tim's own personal turmoil bled through that the album reached its most profound emotional heights. I Never Asked to Be Your Mountain was a raw, brutally honest, and deeply uncomfortable confessional addressed directly to his estranged wife, Mary Gibbert, and the infant son, Jeff, he had left behind. The lyrics are a torrent of guilt, justification, and raw, wounded pride. The flying Pisces sails for time and tells me of my child, wrapped in bitter tales and rhymes, because my love is wild. It's the sound of a young man wrestling with the immense weight of his own choices, trying to explain the inexplicable, acknowledging the pain he has caused, while simultaneously defending his restless, artistic spirit. The vocal performance is astonishing, moving from tender whispers to anguished cries, his voice cracking with an almost unbearable emotional honesty. It's a difficult song to listen to, but it remains one of the most powerful and revealing statements he ever recorded. Goodbye and Hello was not a massive commercial smash, but it performed significantly better than his debut, reaching number 171 on the Billboard charts. A respectable showing for such an unconventional album. More importantly, it earned him widespread critical acclaim. He was no longer just another pretty voice. He was recognized as a serious artist, a songwriter, and vocalist of unique power and vision. The album became a cult classic, highly regarded by fans of more adventurous music of the late 60s folk rock scene. His profile grew significantly. He became a fixture on the burgeoning rock circuit, his live performances becoming legendary for their intensity and improvisational daring. He even made appearances on national television, including a famously awkward encounter on The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson. Carson, the king of mainstream entertainment, seemed baffled by Buckley's intense, standoffish demeanor and his refusal to engage in typical celebrity banter. The performance itself was mesmerizing, but the underlying tension highlighted the growing disconnect between Buckley's uncompromising artistic vision and the demands of commercial television. He reportedly refused to lip sync, a common practice at the time, further cementing his reputation as a difficult, principled artist. Image clip of Tim Buckley on TV, perhaps Tonight Show if available. He also embarked on his first tours of Europe, traveling to Denmark, the Netherlands, and, crucially, the UK. In London, he recorded a session for John Peel's influential BBC radio show Top Gear, exposing his music to a receptive British audience that often seemed more attuned to his experimental leanings than American listeners. These early European trips were formative, broadening his horizons and reinforcing his desire to push his music beyond the confines of the American folk rock scene. Goodbye and Hello was a triumph, the sound of an artist finding his true voice. But even in this moment of breakthrough, the seeds of future conflict were present. Tim was already beginning to openly express his disdain for the folk rock label, feeling it was too limiting, too tied to the very scene he was trying to transcend. He bristled at the constant comparisons to Bob Dylan, feeling they missed the point of his unique vocal and compositional style. And the pressure from his manager, Herb Cohen and Elektra Records, to produce more accessible, commercially viable music was already beginning to create friction. He had said goodbye to the simple folk sound, but saying hello to true artistic freedom would prove to be a far more difficult and ultimately more dangerous journey. The year 1968 was a period of consolidation, and more importantly, of deep musical searching for Tim Buckley. He had achieved critical acclaim and a devoted cult following with Goodbye and Hello, but commercially, he was still hovering on the fringes of mainstream success. Elektra Records undoubtedly wanted him to build on the momentum, to deliver another album in a similar vein, perhaps sanding off some of the rougher, more experimental edges to achieve broader radio play. But Tim Buckley was constitutionally incapable of standing still, let alone repeating himself. His ears and his soul were already pulling him in a radically different direction. His lifelong love for jazz, first nurtured by his mother's record collection, now deepened into an all-consuming passion. He immersed himself in the music, not just as a casual listener, but as a serious student. He intensely studied the works of major jazz figures, particularly the innovators who were pushing the boundaries of the form. He was captivated by the complex, shifting time signatures and raw emotional power of Charles Mingus. He absorbed the quirky, angular melodies and harmonic dissonances of Thelonious Monk. He was particularly drawn to the multi-instrumental, spiritually searching explorations of Rahsaan Roland Kirk and the free jazz fire of Pharoah Sanders. Image montage. Album covers of Mingus Monk's Brilliant Corners, Roland Kirk, Pharoah Sanders. This wasn't just about musical influence. It was about finding a new philosophy, a new approach to creativity. Jazz represented freedom, rhythmic freedom, harmonic freedom, and most importantly, improvisational freedom. It was a music that valued spontaneous creation, emotional honesty, and the willingness to take risks, to leap into the unknown without a net. This resonated deeply with Tim's own restless, intuitive spirit. He began to see the rigid verse-chorus structure of the traditional folk and rock song as a straitjacket. He yearned for the open spaces, the extended forms, the conversational interplay of jazz. This transformation began to manifest dramatically in his live performances. His concerts became less like folk recitals and more like jazz explorations. Songs would stretch out, morphing into extended improvisations. He encouraged his band, particularly the gifted lead guitarist Lee Underwood, whose own playing was heavily jazz-influenced, to take chances to respond to him in the moment. And Tim himself began to use his voice in increasingly radical ways. He wasn't just singing melodies anymore. He was using his astonishing 4-octave range as an improvisational instrument, mimicking the sounds of trumpets and saxophones, unleashing wordless scats, soaring into ecstatic falsetto screams, and plunging into deep, resonant baritone moans. He was pushing the physical limits of his voice, exploring its textural possibilities, treating it less as a vehicle for lyrics and more as a direct channel for emotion. Fortunately for posterity, one of these transformative performances was captured on tape. In July 1968, while on his second tour of Europe, he played a stunning concert at the Queen Elizabeth Hall in London. The recording, shelved for decades and finally released in 1990 as the album Dream Letter, Live in London, 1968, is a crucial document of this pivotal moment. It showcases a band and a singer operating at an incredible peak of intuitive communication, stretching the boundaries of folk rock into something far more fluid, dynamic, and emotionally raw. The album captures Tim Buckley in the very act of becoming Tim Buckley, moving beyond his folk rock origins and embracing the challenging freedom of jazz-inspired improvisation. This radical shift, however, was not without its consequences. While his hardcore fans were often mesmerized by these intense, unpredictable performances, more casual listeners, those drawn in by the melodic beauty of his earlier work, were often baffled, even alienated. The folk scene, which had initially embraced him, began to view him with suspicion. He was breaking the rules, blurring the lines, refusing to fit neatly into any category. The pressure from his record label and management to return to a more commercial sound undoubtedly intensified. But Tim Buckley was resolute. He had tasted freedom, and there was no turning back. He was ready to make the definitive statement of his new artistic identity. By 1969, Tim Buckley was a man standing deliberately at a crossroads. He had achieved a measure of fame and critical respect within the folk rock world, but his heart now belonged to the improvisational freedom and harmonic complexity of jazz. He was faced with a choice: consolidate his existing fan base by delivering another goodbye and hello, or follow his muse into potentially perilous, commercially uncertain territory. He chose the latter, but with a characteristic complexity that would define his entire career. He managed, for one last brilliant moment, to bridge the gap between his artistic ambitions and commercial appeal. The result was his third studio album, Happy Sad, released in the summer of 1969. The title itself perfectly captured the album's, and perhaps Tim's own, emotional duality. This was a record that existed in the liminal space between joy and sorrow, light and shadow. Musically, it represented a decisive break from his past. Gone were the Baroque orchestrations and psychedelic flourishes of its predecessor. In their place was a warmer, looser, more organic sound, deeply infused with the spirit of jazz. Crucially, Happy Sad marked Tim's emergence as a lyricist in his own right. His partnership with Larry Beckett, which had defined Goodbye and Hello, was temporarily set aside. Tim wrote all the lyrics for Happy Sad himself, and they reflected his new musical direction. More impressionistic, more emotionally direct, less overtly poetic or political than Beckett's work. The songs often felt like intimate late-night conversations, fragments of feeling captured in simple, evocative language. The instrumentation was also radically different. Tim assembled a new ensemble that featured David Friedman on vibraphone and Carter C.C. Collins on congas, alongside Lee Underwood's signature spidery guitar lines and John Miller's fluid acoustic bass. The absence of a traditional rock drum kit gave the music a unique, floating, almost hypnotic quality. The rhythms ebbed and flowed, shifting subtly beneath Tim's soaring vocal improvisations. The songs themselves were longer, more exploratory, often built around simple, repeated vamps that allowed ample space for improvisation. Tracks like the 10-minute Love from Room 109 at the Islander and the 12-minute Gypsy Woman unfolded like languid, dreamlike journeys, Tim's voice weaving intricate, wordless melodies over the shimmering textures created by the vibes, congas, and guitar. Even the album's most accessible track, the beautiful melancholic ballad Buzzin' Fly, possessed a rhythmic subtlety and harmonic sophistication that set it apart from typical folk rock fare. Happy Sad was a bold, artistic statement, a clear declaration of Tim's new musical identity. And surprisingly, it became his most commercially successful album to date. It reached number 81 on the Billboard album charts, a significant achievement for such an unconventional record. It solidified his status as a major cult figure, an artist admired for his integrity and his willingness to follow his own path. His tours became legendary events, attracting devoted audiences eager to witness his mesmerizing, improvisational performances. But even this peak moment contained the seeds of future decline and ongoing personal tragedy. While Happy Sad successfully bridged the gap between folk accessibility and jazz exploration, it also marked a point of no return. He had alienated some of his earlier folk fans who were perhaps bewildered by the new direction, and the taste of commercial success seemed only to intensify the conflict between Tim's artistic impulses and the demands of the music industry. Herb Cohen, his manager, and Elektra Records still craved hit singles, something the sprawling improvisational nature of Happy Sad deliberately avoided. Tim, increasingly protective of his artistic freedom, grew more resistant to any perceived interference, reportedly dismissing attempts to push him towards a more accessible sound as promoting an emotional sham. Furthermore, the personal cost of his relentless artistic drive continued to mount. In early 1975, just months before his death, the only documented meeting between Tim and his 8-year-old son, Jeffrey Scott, took place. The encounter was reportedly brief, awkward, and emotionally fraught, leaving a lasting scar on the young boy who would later wrestle with his father's complex legacy in his own brilliant, tragic musical career. The song I Never Asked to Be Your Mountain was a confession, but it was not an apology, and the distance between father and son remained vast and largely unbridgeable. Compounding these emotional complexities was Tim's own internal struggle. The depression and anxiety rooted in his traumatic childhood reportedly intensified during this period, despite his professional success. According to friends like Lee Underwood, Tim began experimenting more heavily with drugs, not just marijuana but also barbiturates and downers, seeking solace or perhaps just oblivion from the relentless pressures and the persistent ghosts of his past. He began fatefully to romanticize drug use, speaking in interviews about using substances as tools to unlock creativity or achieve altered states of consciousness, a dangerous justification that masked a deepening dependency and ignored the very real risks of addiction and overdose. The happy, sad duality was not just an album title, it was becoming the defining, precarious balance of his own life. The period immediately following the release and relative success of Happy Sad was one of almost superhuman manic creativity for Tim Buckley. It was as if finding his jazz-infused voice had opened a floodgate. Instead of basking in the glow of his highest chart position yet, or attempting to consolidate his success with a similar follow-up, he plunged headlong into a period of intense, almost frantic recording activity. In the latter half of 1969 and early 1970, he wrote and recorded material for not one, but 3 distinct and dramatically different albums, almost simultaneously. This astonishing burst of creativity reflected the warring impulses within him. On one hand, there was a desire perhaps fueled by pressure from his management and label to create something more accessible, something that could build on the success of Happy Sad. On the other hand, his artistic muse was pulling him inexorably towards more radical, more challenging, and far less commercial territories. The first of these albums to emerge was Blue Afternoon, released in November 1969. Significantly, this album was released not on Elektra, but on Straight Records, the adventurous, artist-run label founded by Frank Zappa and Herb Cohen. This move likely gave Tim more creative freedom than he felt he had at Elektra. Blue Afternoon is perhaps the most straightforwardly beautiful and emotionally accessible album of this period. It continued the mellow, jazz-inflected folk sound of Happy Sad, but with warmer, more conventional song structures and lyrics that often focused on themes of love and longing. Tracks like Happy Time and the title track possess a gentle, almost torch song quality, showcasing the pure, heartbreaking beauty of Tim's tenor voice. It felt like a natural progression, the kind of album Elektra had likely hoped for. But even as he was recording Blue Afternoon, Tim was simultaneously working on material that was pushing far beyond its gentle boundaries. The second album to emerge from this fertile period, released just a few months later in early 1970, was Lorca. Named after the Spanish surrealist poet Federico Garcia Lorca, the album was a stark, challenging, and often deeply unsettling listening experience. It plunged headfirst into the world of avant-garde jazz and experimental music. The songs were largely devoid of conventional melody or structure, built instead around dissonant harmonies, shifting time signatures, and Tim's increasingly extreme vocal improvisations. He used his voice not just to sing, but to moan, whisper, shriek, and explore the very limits of human sound, drawing inspiration from avant-garde composers like Luciano Berio and Ioannis Xenakis. Tracks like the title track and Anonymous Proposition are intense, demanding pieces that alienated many of the folk and jazz fans who had embraced Happy Sad. Lorca was a commercial disaster, selling poorly and baffling critics. It was the sound of an artist deliberately alienating mainstream audiences. And he wasn't finished. The third album recorded during this intense period and arguably the pinnacle of his experimental phase was Star Sailor, also released in 1970. If Lorca was a step into the avant-garde, Star Sailor represented a complete immersion in free jazz and experimental vocal techniques. Working with a band that included talented musicians capable of navigating his increasingly complex and demanding compositions, Tim created a work of dense, challenging, and often breathtakingly original music. The centerpiece of the album was Song to the Siren, a hauntingly beautiful, ethereal ballad that stood in stark contrast to the album's more challenging material. While largely ignored upon release, Song to the Siren would slowly gain legendary status over the decades, becoming his most covered and enduring song. A cult classic rediscovered by artists like This Mortal Coil, Robert Plant, Brian Ferry, and Sinead O'Connor. But the rest of Star Sailor was pure, unadulterated experimentalism, featuring Tim's voice pushed to its absolute limits, from deep guttural growls to impossibly high, piercing shrieks. This incredible, almost simultaneous outpouring of 3 such distinct albums in less than a year was a testament to Tim Buckley's immense creativity, but also perhaps a sign of his growing internal fragmentation. He was trying to be all things at once: the sensitive folk singer, the jazz improviser, the avant-garde explorer. The pressure to reconcile these conflicting artistic identities, combined with the commercial failure of his more experimental work and his ongoing personal struggles, was creating an unsustainable tension. He had achieved a new level of artistic freedom, but that freedom had come at the cost of his audience, his financial stability, and perhaps his own fragile peace of mind. His intense creativity seemed increasingly unstable, perhaps becoming self-destructive. He had reached the furthest shores of musical exploration. With Lorca and Star Sailor, Tim Buckley had pushed his voice and his music into realms of avant-garde jazz and vocal extremism that few artists before or since have dared to tread. He had achieved a kind of terrifying artistic freedom, creating works of challenging, uncompromising, and often breathtaking originality. He had followed his muse to the very edge of the map, but the view from the edge was bleak. These albums, while later hailed by critics and cult followers as masterpieces of experimentalism, were commercial catastrophes upon their release in 1970. They baffled and alienated the folk and jazz audiences who had embraced Happy Sad. The intricate beauty that had defined his earlier work seemed to many to have been replaced by harsh dissonance and extreme vocal techniques. Headlines screamed things like Buckley yodeling. He was mocked as pretentious, difficult, deliberately obscure. The financial consequences were devastating. Elektra Records, unwilling to support his radical new direction, had dropped him. His new home, Frank Zappa and Herb Cohen's Straight Records, while more artistically adventurous, lacked the promotional muscle and financial stability of a major label. Sales plummeted, gigs dried up. Tim Buckley, the former folk rock prodigy, found himself creatively liberated but professionally adrift, nearly bankrupt, and increasingly isolated. He retreated, licking his wounds. He disbanded the brilliant ensemble of musicians who had helped him create Star Sailor. He moved into a small house in Venice Beach, California, reportedly painting the interior black, a fitting reflection of his darkening mood. There were rumors, likely apocryphal, but indicative of his desperation, that he took odd jobs, driving a cab, even briefly re-enrolling in college courses at UCLA, searching for some semblance of stability or direction. The man who had flown so high was now dangerously close to crashing. The artistic freedom he had so fiercely pursued had led him to a commercial dead end. The pressure mounted from his manager, from his new wife Judy, and from the simple, brutal necessity of making a living. He was faced with another stark choice: continue down the path of uncompromising, commercially unviable experimentation and risk, fading into complete obscurity, or make a significant shift, embrace a more accessible sound, and attempt to reclaim a place in the mainstream music world. For a man whose entire career had been defined by a relentless forward motion, the decision to look back or even sideways was a profound compromise. But survival, it seemed, demanded it. The new direction, when it came, was as unexpected and, in its own way, as radical as his plunge into the avant-garde. Tim Buckley, the ethereal folk poet, the free jazz vocal explorer, decided to get funky. Deeply, explicitly, sweatily funky. In 1971, seeking a new label and a new sound, he signed with Warner Brothers Records, the corporate giant. It was a move that surprised many, signaling perhaps a renewed focus on commercial viability. He assembled a new band, drawing from the pool of talented musicians in the Los Angeles R&B and funk scene, and he began writing songs that were a world away from the poetic introspection of Goodbye and Hello, or the abstract expressionism of Star Sailor. The result, released in 1972, was the album Greetings from L.A. It was a full-blown embrace of funk, rock, and blue-eyed soul, driven by heavy bass lines, syncopated rhythms, and raw, powerful guitar riffs. And lyrically, it was a seismic shift. Gone was the poetic ambiguity, the gentle romanticism. In its place was a raw, explicit, almost confrontational exploration of sexuality, desire, and the darker, more desperate side of Los Angeles nightlife. Songs like Get on Top were built around raw, driving funk grooves and lyrics that left absolutely nothing to the imagination. Sweet Surrender was a soulful, almost pleading ballad, but still carried an undercurrent of raw, physical need. The album was drenched in a kind of late-night, sweaty, desperate hedonism. Even Tim's voice had changed. While the incredible range was still there, the angelic purity was often replaced by a rougher, grittier, more overtly masculine growl. What drove this radical transformation? Was it a genuine artistic evolution, an authentic embrace of the funk and soul music that had always been part of his diverse influences? Was it a calculated, perhaps cynical commercial move, an attempt to tap into the burgeoning funk rock market and finally achieve mainstream radio play? Or was it something deeper, more psychological? Was this raw, aggressive sexuality a reaction against the ethereal, almost androgynous image of his earlier career? Was it an attempt to reclaim a sense of conventional masculinity, perhaps in response to the lingering wounds inflicted by his father's homophobic taunts? Was the man who had been called a faggot now trying to prove his virility in the most explicit way possible? The truth, as always with Tim Buckley, is likely a complex mixture of all these things. What is certain is that Greetings from L.A. was a bold, confrontational, and utterly unexpected statement. The critical reaction was predictably mixed. Some critics admired the album's raw energy and Buckley's fearless stylistic leap, seeing it as a bold reinvention. Others, particularly those who cherished his earlier folk and jazz work, were appalled. They saw it as a compromise, an attempt to chase commercial trends that sacrificed his artistic integrity. Headlines lamented the loss of the poet, bewildered by the perceived crudeness of the new material. Commercially, the gamble did not pay off. While the album performed slightly better than Lorca and Star Sailor, it was far from a mainstream hit. Crucially, it failed to get significant radio airplay. The frank, often explicit sexual content of the lyrics made the album toxic for programmers. Once again, Tim Buckley found himself alienated from his old audience without fully connecting with a new one. He was trapped between worlds, a musical refugee in his own career. His live shows during this period reflected this shift. He embraced a more overtly rock star persona, prowling the stage, his performances fueled by a raw, aggressive energy. But the reports from these shows are often contradictory. Some recall electrifying, powerful performances. Others describe a sense of desperation, of an artist trying too hard, of the confrontational lyrics sometimes falling flat or even alienating the very audiences he was trying to win over. The man who had once mesmerized crowds into silence with the sheer beauty of his voice was now sometimes met with confusion or indifference. His personal life remained tumultuous. His marriage to Judy Brajo Sutcliffe provided a semblance of stability, and by all accounts he was a loving stepfather to Taylor. But the financial pressures, the professional disappointments, and his ongoing struggles with depression and addiction continued to cast a long shadow. The man who sang with such raw, uninhibited desire on Greetings from L.A. was, according to those close to him, increasingly withdrawn and plagued by self-doubt in his private life. The funk experiment had been a bold move, but it had not provided the salvation he was seeking. The abyss was still waiting. The commercial failure of Greetings from L.A., despite its undeniable musical power, placed Tim Buckley in an increasingly precarious position. He was now signed to a major label, Warner Brothers, which had expectations of recouping its investment. The pressure to deliver a hit, a genuine, radio-friendly, chart-climbing hit, was immense and unrelenting. His manager, Herb Cohen, who had perhaps indulged Tim's experimental whims for as long as he could, was now likely pushing hard for a more commercially viable direction. Tim Buckley, the uncompromising artistic visionary, found himself under immense pressure, forced to make compromises that seemed to go against the very core of his restless, exploratory nature. The two albums that followed, released in 1973 and 1974 respectively, represent the sound of an artist adrift, searching for solid ground in a musical landscape that no longer seemed to have a place for him. They are the most controversial and often dismissed albums in his catalog, the sound of a genius perhaps losing his way or simply trying desperately to survive. Sophronia, released in 1973, was a confusing, eclectic, and ultimately uneven collection. It featured a mix of original material and, significantly, several cover songs, a move that suggested a lack of confidence in his own songwriting or pressure from the label to include more familiar material. The production was slicker, more polished, aiming for a smooth, radio-friendly, almost middle-of-the-road sound. There were moments of undeniable beauty, particularly his haunting rendition of Fred Neil's Dolphins, which became a live favorite. But overall, the album lacked the focus and intensity of his earlier work. It felt like a compromise, an attempt to please everyone that ultimately pleased no one. Despite the album's lukewarm reception, his reputation, particularly in Europe, still carried enough weight to secure him a spot at the prestigious Knebworth Festival in England in 1974, opening for acts like the Allman Brothers Band and Van Morrison. It was a rare, high-profile performance during this period, a brief reminder of the heights he had scaled just a few years earlier. But even this appearance seemed to highlight his diminished status, a former innovator now relegated to an early slot on a bill dominated by more commercially successful artists. His final album released during his lifetime, Look at the Fool, marked a further and perhaps final descent into creative confusion. The album experimented with a strange blend of soul, funk, and even hints of Latin music, sometimes dubbed Tijuana Soul. The production was often cluttered, the arrangements sometimes awkward, but it's the lyrics that are perhaps most revealing. Gone was the explicit sexuality of greetings from L.A. In its place was a palpable sense of desperation, world weariness, and profound self-doubt. The title track itself seemed to reflect painful self-criticism. The album was a commercial disaster and was savaged by the few critics who bothered to review it. Even Tim himself reportedly expressed dissatisfaction with these later albums, feeling they were dictated more by commercial considerations than by his own artistic vision. What was happening to the man who had created Star Sailor? Was this simply a creative slump, an inevitable downturn in an artistic career? Or was it something deeper? Was this the sound of a man losing confidence in his artistic instincts? Was he desperately trying to find any audience, any way to make a living through his art, even if it meant compromising the very principles of innovation and authenticity that had once defined him? The psychological toll of this period must have been immense. The man who had once been hailed as a visionary was now struggling for relevance. His finances were reportedly precarious. His relationships, both personal and professional, were strained. The alienation he felt from the music industry, and perhaps even from his own audience, deepened his cynicism. Anecdotes from this time paint a picture of a man increasingly weary, reluctant to sign autographs, guarded and distrustful in interviews. The youthful energy of his early career seemed gone, replaced by weariness stemming from unfulfilled potential and past disappointments. His struggles with addiction reportedly worsened during this period. The drugs that had once been perhaps romanticized as tools for creativity were now more clearly a desperate means of escape, a way to numb the pain of his professional disappointments and his ongoing internal turmoil. Friends worried about his health, his erratic behavior, his deepening spiral. He seemed to be a man adrift, searching for an anchor in a storm that showed no signs of abating. His once bright career momentum was fading rapidly. By the spring of 1975, Tim Buckley's career seemed to have reached its nadir. The major label deal was over. His last two albums had been commercial and critical failures. He was relegated to playing smaller venues, often to audiences who came expecting the gentle folk singer of his early years and were bewildered by his later, more challenging material or his attempts at commercial funk. He was financially strapped, his reputation diminished, a man seemingly lost in the wilderness of his own uncompromising artistic journey. Yet even in this period of profound difficulty, there were signs of a potential resurgence, a flicker of the old fire. He still possessed that incredible once-in-a-generation voice, an instrument capable of breathtaking beauty and terrifying power, and he retained a small but fiercely loyal cult following, fans who revered his fearless experimentation and his raw emotional honesty. There were reportedly plans in the works for a comeback, talk of recording a live album that would capture the energy of his often incendiary stage performances, a chance to perhaps reconnect with his audience on his own terms. In June of 1975, he embarked on a short tour of Texas, playing a series of club dates. Eyewitness accounts from these final shows are poignant. Some recall a man who seemed tired, perhaps going through the motions. Others describe moments of astonishing brilliance, flashes of the old magic, his voice soaring with that familiar, heart-stopping power. He played a final reportedly well-received show in Dallas on June 28th. After the gig, he returned to his home in Santa Monica, California. The events of the following day, June 29th, 1975, remain somewhat unclear due to conflicting accounts and the difficulty of reconstructing tragic events. What is known is this: Tim spent part of the day celebrating the completion of the tour, reportedly drinking with friends. Later that evening, he went to the house of a casual acquaintance, a man named Richard Keeling. According to Keeling's later testimony and police reports, Tim ingested heroin at Keeling's house. Crucially, most accounts indicate he did not inject the drug, but rather snorted it or perhaps ingested it orally. There has been much speculation about Tim's state of mind and his intentions that night. Was this a deliberate suicidal act by a man finally succumbing to years of depression and professional disappointment? Was it a reckless, impulsive decision fueled by alcohol and a misguided belief in his own tolerance? Or was it, as some have argued, a tragic, fatal miscalculation? Had he, perhaps after a period of relative sobriety while on tour, simply misjudged the potency of the drug or his body's ability to handle it? Richard Keeling would later claim that Tim had approached the heroin almost as a challenge, wanting to prove he could handle it, a statement that adds another layer of perhaps reckless confidence to the story. Whatever the precise circumstances, the result was catastrophic. After ingesting the heroin, Tim returned to his own home in Santa Monica. His wife, Judy, was there. She reportedly found him in a state of severe intoxication and distress. Angry and perhaps unaware of the lethal danger he was in, she put him to bed, telling him to rest. But his condition worsened rapidly. His breathing became shallow. His skin turned blue. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Judy and a friend attempted CPR and called for paramedics. It was too late. Tim Buckley was rushed to the hospital, but efforts to revive him were unsuccessful. He was pronounced dead later that evening. The official cause of death was listed as an overdose due to ingestion of heroin, morphine, and ethanol. His death was ruled accidental. He was 28 years old. The music world was stunned. While Buckley's struggles were known to insiders, his death was sudden and unexpected. The loss of such a unique and prodigious talent felt overwhelming. His funeral was held a few days later in Santa Monica. It was a relatively small, somber affair, attended by about 200 family members and friends. Notably, his estranged son, Jeff, then just 8 years old, was reportedly not invited or informed until after the fact, a final separation in their tragically brief and distant relationship. The legal aftermath was minimal. Richard Keeling was arrested and charged, not with murder, but with involuntary manslaughter and furnishing heroin. In a controversial decision, he was eventually sentenced to just 120 days in jail and probation. The man who had provided the fatal dose faced minimal consequences. Tim Buckley died deeply in debt, his years of commercial struggle leaving him with few material possessions beyond his beloved guitars and amplifiers. His mother's reported premonition years earlier that he, like the romantic poets he admired, would die young had become a tragic, self-fulfilling prophecy. His restless life had come to a sudden tragic end. After his death, Tim Buckley's legacy seemed fragile. He had not enjoyed the huge commercial success of Hendrix or Morrison, and his radical stylistic changes had alienated fans, leaving him in danger of being forgotten. A critical resurgence came unexpectedly through his largely unknown son, Jeff Buckley. In the early 1990s, Jeff's own rise, culminating in a 1991 tribute concert in which he performed his father's songs, launched his career, and simultaneously sparked a wave of renewed, intense interest in Tim's work. This wave of interest led to reissues of his diverse catalog, making challenging albums like Lorca and Star Sailor accessible to a new generation. More importantly, the release of powerful live recordings revealed the true magic of his improvisational performances, cementing his reputation as a groundbreaking innovator. His influence became clear, inspiring artists from post-punk to alternative rock, though his most direct and tragic legacy remains his son, Jeff. Ultimately, Tim Buckley is seen not as a commercial casualty, but as a symbol of uncompromising artistic integrity. He was a man ahead of his time, a musical chameleon who defied all categorizations and pursued his muse no matter the cost. His life was a profound American tragedy defined by contradictions, an angelic voice born of a dark past, the conflict between art and commerce, and a man who abandoned his son but made music that was unbearably intimate. Buckley's legacy lies not in his platinum records, but in the rabid devotion of his fans, the relentless discovery of new listeners, and the profound influence he had on artists who dared to follow his bold path. Above all, his legacy lives on in his voice, a remarkable 4-octave instrument capable of conveying a universe of emotions, from ecstatic joy to profound sadness. It was a voice that was restless, haunting, and always searching. Tim Buckley is gone, but that unforgettable voice remains,